All right, so let's jump right in. Today, we're talking about a really critical moment, a real fork in the road for the psychedelic movement. After years of explosive promise and hope, the conversation is getting really serious, and the stakes have just never been higher. And this one quote, it just nails the massive shift that we're digging into. It's all about moving away from the spectacle and towards substance. This really marks the moment psychedelics started the journey from the counterculture into the clinic, from just a promise into an actual profession. So what did this getting serious phase actually look like? Well, the focus totally shifted from the why to the how. The conversation moved way beyond just talking about access and started getting into the nitty-gritty work of building real-world therapeutic systems that could actually support healing safely and, effectively. And this was a huge shift in how people were talking about it. All the big kind of abstract ideas about consciousness, they started getting really grounded in clinical reality. The focus sharpened right onto specific conditions like PTSD, depression, and addiction, places where these tools showed the most immediate, measurable potential. Now, what's really interesting is that this wasn't some top-down federal thing. Nope, it was happening on the ground, state by state, as different regulators began the slow, really careful work of building the guardrails for healing. And as you can see, there was no single playbook. Instead, each state took these careful, very clinical approaches. You had Oregon tightening up its training standards, Colorado building out its rules with a real focus on equity, and Texas just doubling down on veteran care for PTSD. The pattern was crystal clear, slow, deliberate, and driven by data. Okay, so at the very heart of this whole clinical model is one key idea: integration. It stopped being this afterthought, like, oh yeah, do a follow-up session. It became its own core discipline. And that's a huge recognition that the real work, the real healing, starts long after the session itself is over. And I love this analogy because it's just so perfect. The psychedelic experience might give you this profound insight. It opens the door, but integration, that's the long, necessary work of actually weaving that insight into the fabric of your life. It's a difference between just peeking into a new room and actually learning how to live in the whole house. Huge difference. But right when things were starting to look solid, right when the field was building all this hard-won credibility, a new, dangerous problem started brewing: a tension between the slow, messy human pace of healing and the absolute breakneck speed of the market. And this created a brand new fight, really: growth versus guardrails. You've got the pressures of big money and the demand for rapid expansion, and it started creating these serious structural risks that threatened to undo all the careful progress that had been made. Here's the fundamental problem, right? Capital and human healing are on two totally different clocks. Venture timelines demand results, like now, quarterly reports, patient throughput, but real integration, it's not linear. It takes months, sometimes years. It just doesn't fit neatly on a spreadsheet. So, to get that money, a really dangerous game started. Companies began throwing around the language of transformation and healing in their pitch decks. They were basically borrowing trust they hadn't actually earned and using these big words to mask a real lack of clinical infrastructure. And this leads to something really insidious, what some people are calling the monetization of mystique. They're basically selling access to meaning itself. This pumps up expectations like crazy, and it creates this subtle pressure where if things go wrong, it's kind of reframed as your personal failure, not a failure of the system. And you know who gets hit first by all this pressure to scale? The healers, the actual clinicians. They're being forced to rush care, to follow these rigid one-size-fits-all protocols, and they start to experience what's called moral injury. It's this slow erosion of your ethical center, and it's leading a lot of the best people to just quietly walk away. So, what happens when that gap between what's promised in the slick marketing and what people actually experience gets too wide? Trust just collapses, and you can't build that back up with more marketing. The only way to rebuild it is with restraint. Okay, but it's not all doom and gloom. This isn't a done deal. There are leaders and regulators who see this danger, who see this clear fork in the road, and they're actively choosing a different path, a path toward a future that can actually last. And the very first step on that smarter path is getting one simple thing. Psychedelics are fundamentally different. They are not a consumer product with a stigma problem, like cannabis was. We're talking about powerful interventions that interact with a person's deepest psychology. So that cannabis playbook of just rapid commercialization, it just doesn't apply here.
So you've got two different game plans on the table. The cannabis playbook, it's all about access, throughput, and normalizing consumption. But a responsible psychedelics playbook, like the one we're starting to see emerge in places like Washington State, it optimizes for something totally different: clinical accountability. It normalizes responsibility.
So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, it's built on four key pillars that all work together. First, you professionalize the field with real credentialing. Then, you ensure accountability with mandatory data tracking for both the good and the bad outcomes. You shape safe operations with actual liability frameworks. And, maybe most importantly, you make deep long-term integration a non-negotiable part of the care.
And all of this brings us to what I think is the most important idea in this whole story. The real breakthrough, the real innovation here, it isn't the molecule. It's building the systems of care that are actually worthy of the powerful experiences these things can create. You have to get this. Healing does not happen in a bubble. If you give someone this massive, life-changing insight, but you don't give them any support to weave it into their family, their job, their community, well, that's not healing. That's just exposure. It can actually be destabilizing.
And this right here, this is the whole ball game. This is what the future of the entire field depends on. If transformation doesn't happen in isolation, then our systems of care can't just stop when you walk out the clinic door. They have to extend into the messy, complicated, and beautiful reality of a person's life.
So I want to leave you with this final thought. The question isn't, do they work anymore? We're past that. The real question, the one that matters now, is this: will the industry being built around them show the maturity and the responsibility to actually earn the right to last? That's what's on the line.